Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Banning Liebscher podcast. And it is once again your favorite substitute, Becky Johnson, joining you this week. Always love sitting down with you guys for this little nugget throughout the week. Hopefully it's encouraging and challenging to you. And we just love that you're listening on the Jesus Culture Podcast Network. This week, I want to bring you guys to 2 Kings, a story in 2 Kings with Hezekiah, who was a king of Judah. And I want to talk about first responses and the role that prayer plays in our lives. And a great example of this is in the story of Hezekiah in 2 Kings. The quick context is that he is king of Judah, and the Assyrian king is coming against Judah. And they send, his name is Sennacherib, the enemy king. And he sends this really threatening letter to Hezekiah, who is reigning in Judah. And, on the surface, militarily, the enemy is stronger. Sennacherib is stronger in his military strength, in his resources. His reputation is a king that has taken over and defeated many other nations. And so the threat is, I say that to paint the picture that the threat is real. Sometimes threats come at us, or we read about situations like this, and it's like, oh, there's no reason to worry because the threat isn't that menacing. But this threat that Hezekiah is facing is a real threat. It's a serious threat, and he has every reason to be afraid and to kind of, when I read it, I think he has every reason to kind of go into panic mode. And we see his response here is something that we can learn a lot from. And I think you can apply it to your life today, right after we talk through it. Something that you can practically walk away with. A lesson here in Scripture. Hezekiah receives the letter, and it's a nasty letter. And he receives it, and this is what it says in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 14. Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. So he reads the threat. And Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread the letter before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed before the Lord and said, O Lord God of Israel, you are enthroned above the cherubim. You are God, you alone of all kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see, and hear the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. And then he goes on to say, Truly, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste to nations and their lands and have cast their gods into fire, for they were not gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they were destroyed. So now, O Lord our God, save us, please, from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, O Lord, are God alone. I love this prayer. I love this response. I love what Hezekiah is teaching us, what the Lord is teaching us through Hezekiah in this moment. And it is this issue of first response. What is your first response? What is my first response to a threatening situation, to an obstacle, to opposition, to an attack? Here's what I love about this story. You see, Hezekiah is a king, so he has a military. It might not be the strongest one, but he has a military that is at his beck and call. He could have responded to this threat by mobilizing his army. He could have responded with a letter himself. I think just out of my own human nature thinks, why didn't he write a letter? If I'm getting a letter like he got, I've got some words to say back. I want to engage in this threatening discussion back and forth, and I want to tell this enemy who has mocked my God and is threatening to take over my nation, I want to tell him what I'll do to him if he tries to do that. I want to gather my own military. I want to somehow get in the stance and the posture of fighting back. And here's what Hezekiah does instead. He takes the threat itself. He takes the letter and he takes it and he spreads it out before the Lord. It's such a picture of what our first response should be to trouble, is that we take it to the Lord in prayer. A couple things I want to highlight here. One, Hezekiah reads the letter. Here's the thing. We don't have to not acknowledge our threats. I'm going to use that word for, anything that comes against us. Any discouraging situation, threats, attacks, opposition. He doesn't ignore it. I think sometimes we think that godly, a godly response is to just deny that it's happening or pretend it's not happening. No, Hezekiah goes, this is happening. I am being threatened. I'm going to read it. I'm not going to be afraid of it. I think sometimes we'll talk about that in a minute. We want to, out of fear, we just don't want to face the hardship. Out of fear, we don't want to admit that it's there. We don't want to acknowledge the threat or the troubling thing. But he doesn't. He reads it because he knows where his help comes from. He's not afraid to acknowledge the threat because he knows that God is on his side. So he reads it. Listen, you can face the threats in your life. You can face the opposition. You don't have to deny that it's happening. You don't have to live like it's not there. You can face it. You need to. You need to know what's coming against you so you know how to position yourself in prayer. We cannot live these lives that is just pretending that nothing bad is happening and everything is all roses. I think at the core of that is a lack of trusting God. We don't even want to face hardship or admit that it's there because we actually don't trust where our help comes from. So Hezekiah faces it. This is happening to me. This is real. This is scary. And then he takes the letter. He goes up to the house of the Lord. Get in the presence of God. When threats come, when you face opposition, get to the house of God. Get in the presence. Acknowledge it. You can receive it. Okay, this is happening. Here's the diagnosis. Here's the bill. Here's the broken relationship. Here's whatever it might be for you. And then get into the presence of God. He doesn't mobilize his army first. He doesn't begin to craft his own letter back. He doesn't panic. He gets to the house of God. He gets in the presence and he takes that very threat and he spreads the letter out before the Lord. Here's his acknowledgement. It takes humility in Hezekiah as a leader to say, I can't do anything about this. I need you first, God. His first response is to spread it out before the Lord and give it to him. It would take a whole other podcast to dissect the prayer, but Hezekiah's prayer here hits some really key points. He acknowledges the power of God. That's how he begins. We have to first say, God, this is who you are. Our first response shouldn't be, can you do anything about this? God, look at me. Oh my gosh, I'm so scared. Our first response to threatening situations, our first response to tragedy, to drama, our first response needs to be, you alone are God. You are God of the universe. You are God of the earth. And I trust you. Here's what he's doing. He's taking his human perspective, which is to see the threat coming at him, and he elevates it by saying, this is the God I serve. This is how powerful he is, how sovereign he is, how real he is. So elevate your perspective in these moments. We're all facing something difficult. I can guarantee whoever you are, wherever you're listening from, you are facing some sort of threat. Some letter has come at you. Get the perspective of who your God is. And I think this is what positions Hezekiah in a place of strength. He says, this is who you are, God. And then he says, so hear my prayer. Ask the Lord to hear you. Incline your ear to me. He asks for help. And then at the end he says, not so that I will be saved, not so that my kingdom would know peace, not, hey, God, save me and deliver me from this so that all the people will admire my kingship. Man, how many times are our prayers just baked with selfish ambition? Hezekiah's prayer ends with, God, would you move in this situation and would you rescue us and deliver us so that the world may know that you, O Lord, are God alone. Guys, can we be honest about this? Sometimes we're praying for God to move on our behalf so that we would get the glory. so that we would be esteemed in people's eyes, so that we would just know peace. Sometimes we're just like, hey, we don't want to deal with it, God. Won't you move because don't you care about my comfort? Hezekiah says, won't you move so that the world would know that you alone are God? That's the posture of prayer, that we are praying that God would be glorified in every situation so that the world would know his fame, his renown, his glory. But this isn't a podcast about prayer, which we should have. This is a podcast about first response. Prayer needs to be our first response, not our last resort. And I think if we're honest, it is often our last resort. We go to prayer after we've exhausted everything else. We get up to the house of God and we spread the letters before him when we are at the end of our own rope. And it's just not the model in Scripture. It's not the model that works, you guys. Prayer is our first response. We see Jesus constantly pulling away. First response of Jesus in many situations over and over is prayer, pulling away to pray to the Father. It's our first response, not our last resort, to bring our situations directly to God and begin to petition in prayer out of a place of trust. You see how he begins in a place of trust. We have to start with a place of, God, I know that you are good. I know I can trust you. I know your character. Therefore, I'm bringing this situation to you in prayer because I know that you love me. I know that you are powerful. I know you can do something about this that I can't. So I thought about what are some of our first responses? What are some of my first responses that get in the way of what I'm called to do, which is to bring every situation, Paul over and over to the new Christians as he's training them is, hey, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, bring your requests to God. Pray always. Give thanks always. He's constantly pointing the first century church to prayer first, not last. Some of our first responses, I think the most common are, one is worry. Our first response to threatening situations, to scary news, to heaviness is, I'm going to worry. I'm going to worry about this. And when all of my worry is done and when I cannot worry anymore, then I will take it to prayer. Then I will take it to the Lord. These things are in opposition to one another. Jesus tells us this. He says, don't worry about anything. Don't worry. That's what the Gentiles do. That's what the world does. You are not called to live in worry. Worry is actually, I think, one of the most socially acceptable sins that we commit and rally around and build ideologies around the power of worry. Again, getting into another podcast there. So we worry first. Some of us move into control. I'm going to control everything now. I am scared. So out of panic, I just begin to look at what I can control and I begin making moves out of my own strength and out of my own effort. And I'm going to show the world and myself that I've got this by my own control. And so some of us, myself included, turn into textbook grade A world-class control freaks. You go into hyper control mode when you're scared rather than taking that threat directly to the Lord and acknowledging, I can't do anything about this. My control is useless here. God, I need you. So we go into worry, we go into control. And the third is I think we numb. We numb by distractions. Bad news comes, a situation hits our life. And rather than, maybe we don't even worry about it, we're not going to control it, we just go straight to Netflix. We are just going to numb out. We're going to watch Netflix. We are going to hit the refrigerator. We're going to open up the pantry and find the Cheetos and the ice cream and sit and eat away our problems. We turn to numbing and distraction as our first response, thinking that will do something. Or we just don't, again, we don't want to deal with it. I think those are some of the main offenders that steal the place of prayer in our lives. They compete for that first place where prayer and getting with God should be. We worry, we control, or we distract. So those are the things I want you to be aware of this week and looking for in your own life. Where do I have uncontrollable worry and anxiety? It's probably tied to an area where you have yet to take your letter and spread it before God and say, I need you in this situation. Where are you controlling? I think a really common area for us in this is our finances. We just control, and we're not living generous lives. We're not living in peace over finances, and we're hyper controlling there because we haven't brought our debt to God. We haven't brought our fear of the future to God. We haven't brought our fear of how we're going to pay this bill or take care of this, take care of our families, whatever, to the Lord. So we're controlling there, and it's keeping us from living generous lives. It's keeping the church at large from tithing. The statistics on that, it's crazy. And where in your life are you numbing and distracting? Have you just tuned out of your marriage because it's actually being threatened right now, rather than getting with God and finding out what are we going to do about this? Lord, what do you say about this? Help me with this. You come home and you play a video game and you are on your phone. You're just distracting yourself from dealing with what's going on in the home. Numbing and distracting is an area to really look out for. And any area where you are trying to check out might be tied to a threat you have to deal with and bringing it to the Lord. Prayer, is it our first response or our last resort? That's the lesson in 2 Kings 19 that we see with Hezekiah, king of Judah. Really dive into that story, maybe read that prayer. It starts in verse 14. It's such a phenomenal posture to take with God when we face things that feel so out of our control. And we all do. So take heart this week and be encouraged. There is a first response you can take that will position you for authority and victory and peace. Don't settle for less than what God has for you. Don't settle for these things that come and steal the place of prayer in our lives. But be on guard for them. Watch out for them. And then tear those things down and say, I refuse to be someone who goes to the Lord as my last resort. I'm called to come to him first. What is available to me is more than I could even ask, think, or imagine. The goodness of God and the peace of God awaits you, whatever the situation may be, when you come to him first. All right, guys, thanks so much for being with us. We'll see you next week.